A thin veil of dusk hovered over the snowy expanse beyond the wall, lending a ghostly shimmer to the vast whiteness. Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, stood atop a jagged outcropping of black rock. He gazed down at his people as they gathered below. They were many, hundreds upon hundreds of free folk, come together in grudging unison despite old feuds and rancors, desperate to flee the horrors stirring in the far north. He saw men and women from a dozen clans who had once been separated by hatred and suspicion. He saw thens tall and grim, with bronze discs etched into their armor. He saw hornfoot men, dressed in rags but nimble and hardy. He saw giants that rumbled low words in their own language, broad-shouldered and wrapped in mammoth furs. There were those who despised one another, bitter tribal rivals, but they stood together now, for Mance had convinced them there was a truth more terrible than their ancient enmities. He had been a brother of the Night's Watch once, many years ago. He still remembered the biting cold upon the wall's heights, the swirl of wind through the towers, the oath that had been hammered into his ears. But that was a lifetime ago. Now he wore black wool of a different sort, a cloak that had once been torn and resewn with bright red silk from a captured southern banner. The scarlet thread glinted even under the sparse light, a silent statement of defiance. He had won hearts north of the wall with his music, his cunning, and his willingness to speak openly. Now he commanded the respect of more free folk than any living man in memory. He knew their only chance for true survival was to pass the wall. But the gates would never open willingly. Mance had once tried a peaceful overture, but the stiff-necked lords of the Seven Kingdoms would not listen to pleas from a ragged horde they deemed savage. And so it must be done the old way, by going around, finding weaknesses, and forcing a crossing. Yet recent news from the south had changed his calculations. The realm was in turmoil. Mance's scouts and spies among the traders whispered that King Robert Baratheon was dead, that houses vied for control, that the High Lords were sharpening swords in every corner. Now was the time, Mance thought. No better moment existed to strike while the realm was turned inward. It was madness, but what else was left to them? White Walkers, whites, the creeping shadows in the far north. He had seen what the others could do. Better to face the steel of southern armies than endure an undead storm in these frozen wastes. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way down from the black crag. Tormund Giantsbane, broad as the trunk of an old oak, waited at the bottom. His beard, an unruly bramble of white and ginger, had pieces of ice caught in it. Tormund gave Mance a grim nod but said nothing. No jest came from the man's lips tonight, and that alone told Mance all he needed to know about the mood of the camp. In the hollow behind the rock, 1,000 flickering fires dotted the twilight. The free folk camp stretched in a vast semicircle, tents and lean-tos made from patched hides, stones arranged for hearths, the shapes of cooking pots and the silhouettes of children. The air was tangy with wood smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Hunger gnawed at bellies. Mance could hear the low rumble of the giants complaining, and the restlessness of the rangers who had come to pledge themselves. Soon dawn would come. If all went to plan, they would not be here by midday. He spoke quietly to Tormund, who leaned close. "We move at first light," Mance said. "Have the Vens ready. They know the passage best. If the watch is unprepared, we may breach the wall before nightfall." Tormund's voice was low and gruff. "Is that wise? The crows may be fewer these days, but they have eyes in their towers. You recall how many men they had at Castle Black alone?" "I recall," Mance said, "but they'll be looking toward the east. We'll come from the west. The Shadow Tower is not so well manned, especially now that word of war might have drawn off some. These are desperate times, old friend." Tormund nodded, though his mouth was set in a grim line. "Desperate times indeed. We should be climbing soon if we hope to carry all these folk safely." Mance sensed the unspoken question there. Tormund was a fearless fighter, but he worried for the young and elderly in their midst. "We do what we can. It's our only chance." They parted in silence, each turning to tend to final preparations. Mance moved through the camp, past groups of hunched figures scraping the last morsels from their pots. A handful of children peeked from beneath patched furs. One boy, no more than 8, stared up at Mance with wide eyes. He wore mismatched boots and a battered metal cap too large for his head. Mance gave the boy a nod. The child tried to smile back, but his lips were chapped, and he just lowered his gaze. Mance thought of his own son, crawling in the snow back in a more protected camp. He felt a pang. If he failed here, all the songs he'd sung about bringing safety to the free folk would turn into funeral dirges. But he forced the doubt aside. There was no room for hesitation. Too many lives rode on his decisions. He passed Val, the woman known as the Wildling Princess. She was crouched near a cookfire, stirring a thin broth for a cluster of women and children around her. She held herself with the unassuming grace of a pine marten, every movement measured. Her silver-blonde hair shimmered faintly in the firelight. She looked up at Mance, gave a single nod, then returned to stirring. Words were unnecessary. They both understood the significance of the dawn to come. All around, hushed conversations and hurried activity filled the night. Weapons were sharpened, and everything from stolen steel swords to stone axes was readied. Some men tested the edges with their thumbs, letting a bead of blood testify to the blade's keenness. Others tested bowstrings. One group fed the mammoths. Huge, shaggy beasts with curved tusks. They snorted clouds of steam that drifted skyward. At the heart of the camp, a large fire burned higher than the rest. Rattleshirt, called the Lord of Bones, stood near it, his armor jangling with every movement, fashioned from bones of the beasts he'd slain. He laughed, a harsh and mocking sound that could carry across a battlefield. A few clansmen watched him with ill-concealed distaste. Rattleshirt was cunning, skilled in battle, and unpredictable. Mance, though, had found his alliance useful when uniting the fractious tribes. As Mance made to pass him, Rattleshirt rattled his collection of bones. "We had best hope the crows are half-blind these days," he said in a voice that grated. "I'll not get my shoulders hacked off just because you forgot some little tower." Mance regarded him coolly. "You do your part, you'll be fine. The risk is the same for all of us, no matter how many rattles you wear." Rattleshirt gave an odd laugh. Mance left him to his jeering and went on his way. The night dragged, every hour heavier than the last. The free folk were anxious, unsettled, but determined. If winter had taught them anything, it was that waiting could mean death. They would risk it all on Mance's plan. In the last hour before dawn, Mance stood at the edge of the camp. The sky glimmered faintly, a pale line that separated darkness from uncertain day. A wind whipped down from the far northern ice, raking across the free folks' tents. It carried a distant whisper like the sound of something stirring in the beyond. Mance closed his eyes. He remembered old stories of the long night. He remembered the terror he had glimpsed in the eyes of survivors who had run from the others. Then he heard horns, 3 blasts rolling over the ice, echoing faintly from the direction of the wall. It was so distant that many of the free folk did not catch it. But Mance did. 3 blasts. He stiffened. The Night's Watch used 1 blast for rangers returning, 2 blasts for wildlings, 3 for the others. Yet that code was old, taught to all Black brothers. Mance had never heard 3 blasts during his time on the wall, nor had many living. He felt a chill deeper than the wind's bite, but he heard only silence after. No more horns. The note had come and gone like an ominous dream. His heart beat faster. Perhaps the watch had merely tested a horn, or they had grown paranoid. Or worse, someone had seen something. The others might be moving. The possibility made him want to drive these people south at once. Mance turned and barked orders. The camp stirred with renewed urgency, and so they began the approach to the wall. They marched for hours. The sun rose, an anemic orb behind clouds, but it provided enough light to guide them. Snow crunched underfoot, and the free folk pressed on in near silence. The line stretched back further than the eye could see. Children shivering, mothers clutching toddlers, old men leaning on battered staffs. Warriors strode beside them, scanning the horizon for any sign of a threat. Giants lumbered at the flanks, guiding the mammoths loaded with supplies. Whenever the ground rose to a crest, Mance would pause and glance southward, searching for the top of the wall. It towered 100 leagues long, but in the swirling haze of a winter morning, it was barely visible. By midday, they drew within sight of it, a colossal barrier of solid ice, shimmering a pale blue in the sun's faint rays. For many in the host, it was their first close look at the wall, though they had lived near it their entire lives. The sheer height awed them. Some children gaped in wonder. Others hid behind their mothers. The older free folk looked grim, for they knew how formidable it was. It was said to be 700 feet tall in places, and that there were no passes unguarded. But Mance had scouted. There were cracks, neglected stretches, and hidden ways known by a few. They would not attempt a direct assault on Castle Black. Instead, the largest force would scale the lesser-patrolled western segments near the Shadow Tower. At the same time, smaller parties under Tormund and Rattleshirt would create distractions to the east. The Watchers would be forced to split their attention, or so Mance hoped. The ground rose into rocky hills near the base of the wall. There, the free folk paused under Mance's direction. Sentries fanned out, scanning for black-cloaked rangers. The hush fell again. Then Mance lifted an arm, giving the signal. The free folk advanced, moving carefully up to the sheer face of ice that loomed overhead like a silent god. The wind gusted, howling across the surface. Mance could almost feel it mocking him. Climbers were readied. Men and women who had spent their lives navigating the ice. They carried ropes coiled around their chests, crude climbing picks, and metal spikes. Some had done this before, though never on so large a scale. The rest of the host waited, bodies pressed close for warmth, teeth chattering. A child began to whimper. Mance motioned for hush. They had to keep as quiet as possible. No telling if a watch patrol might be near. The first climbers began their ascent, chipping small footholds in the ice. Their progress was slow, precarious. One slip would send them plummeting. Yet they pressed on. Mance glanced around for Tormund, who should have left with his diversionary party. But Tormund was still near the main group, conferring with a pair of Thens. "They're waiting for the signal," Tormund said when he saw Mance's questioning eyes. "We'll cause our mischief soon enough. Just let us get around that bend. The crows won't know what's hit them." "Be swift," Mance urged. "If they spot us here, our best advantage is lost." Tormund nodded, clapping Mance's shoulder, then lumbered away with a half-dozen men to gather the rest of his infiltration team. Mance exhaled a frosty breath. He scanned the sky, the treetops in the distance, and the edges of the wall for any black silhouettes. Nothing yet. Maybe the gods were smiling on them, or maybe it was the hush before a storm. Minutes crept by like hours. As each climber ascended, ropes were anchored. More followed, rising in lines. The chatter of picks and spikes tapping ice was soft but continuous. If any crow were close enough to listen, the quiet was broken. A sudden yelp shattered the silence. A climber lost his grip. Mance looked up in horror. The man dangled for a moment, arms flailing, but another climber above him seized his rope. With a frantic scramble, they managed to steady him. Relief coursed through the watchers below, but hearts still pounded. The slightest mistake could cause a chain of falling bodies, each tethered to the next. Then a shout rang from above, one of alarm and recognition. A watcher, it must be, high on the wall. Mance whipped around. Indeed, on a platform far off to the west, a black-cloaked figure was pointing toward them. The crow had spotted their attempt. Mance's stomach sank. This was earlier than he'd hoped. They needed more climbers on the ice before the alarm spread. From the tower, a horn blast sounded, low and echoing. Then came a second blast, the signal for wildlings. Mance cursed under his breath. "Faster!" he barked to the climbers. "Go faster if you value your lives." Shouts erupted along the base of the wall as everyone scrambled to follow the plan. Warriors unslung bows, nocked arrows, peered upward. They could see black figures on the walkway. The watchmen had bows too, and soon arrows were raining down. The free folk tried to take cover against the ice, behind small outcroppings of rock. Some returned fire, but their aim was hampered by the angle and the swirling wind. High above, the first arrow found its mark. A climbing woman shrieked as a shaft sprouted from her shoulder. She lost her grip, tried to cling with her legs, but her rope jerked downward. The climbers beneath her scrambled to hold her weight. Her own cries echoed pitifully, turning shrill as she fought the searing pain. Another arrow came from above, missing by inches. Giants at the base roared in anger, but there was nothing they could do but wait. Mance ran among his people. Spread out, return fire, keep climbing or we're done. A few intrepid archers found vantage points behind some broken ice spurs. Their arrows soared up, occasionally forcing a watchman to duck behind the parapet. But the crow archers had the advantage of height and cover. The free folk at the base could do little more than harass them. One giant bellowed, hefting a boulder, but as it hurled the stone upward, it shattered harmlessly against the wall hundreds of feet below the walkway. Chaos roiled. Mothers clutched their children, dragging them behind the partial protection of boulders. Warriors howled as the crow's arrows fell among them. Yet for every free folk who ducked or fled, another pressed forward, determined to climb or support those climbing. If they failed here, they would freeze or die of the creeping doom from the north. Better to risk an arrow than face the others. Minutes stretched. The crows had sounded their horn, and presumably more black brothers would be converging on this spot. Mance realized with a grim certainty that Tormund's diversion would likely start too late. Unless Tormund must have heard that horn as well. Perhaps he would be spurred to action, drawing some watchers away. Up on the wall, the handful of watchers were joined by more. Mance could see the black shapes gathering. But then, off to the east, a thunderous horn blast echoed. Another, that might be Tormund, leading a bold assault from a different quarter. The watchers on the platform hesitated, some turning as if uncertain which threat was greater. That was enough distraction. More and more free folk seized the chance to climb. Rattleshirt led a group around a bend in the ice, trying to find a patch less guarded. The Thens pressed up in disciplined rows. The watchers struggled to keep them all at bay. Arrows continued to rain. Men and women screamed as they fell or dangled. Blood splattered. Mance had learned from bitter experience that war was no clean thing, but the sight of these desperate souls braving that monstrous wall made his heart twist. Still, he pushed them on. This was the way. There was no turning back. Eventually, after what felt like a lifetime, the first wave reached the top. A wildling in a ragged foxfur cloak hauled himself over the rim. He stabbed the first black brother who lunged at him. Two more crawled over not far away and fell upon the watchers with savage ferocity. More scaled up. The watchers were outnumbered at this point, or soon would be. At the base, Mance nodded sharply. We're over," he muttered. "Now hurry, past the ropes." Long lengths of rope were dropped from above, anchored so that others could climb more swiftly. The free folk below began hauling themselves up in a steady stream. The watchers still shot arrows, but the vantage was compromised as the wildlings at the top attacked or forced them to seek cover. Then, with the watchers pinned, the giants stepped forward. A few battered old siege hooks were rigged to ropes. Giants roared as they attempted to haul themselves or the mammoths upward, though it was a perilous task. For a while, it seemed nigh impossible that the mammoths could go up. But Mance trusted the cunning of the free folk. They had done the impossible before. Even if not all could make the climb, enough needed to cross so that they could lower the gates from the southern side and lead the rest through. But that was a future worry. For now, the urgent matter was to secure the top. Mance himself grabbed a rope. Tormund was still absent, presumably engaged on the east side, or perhaps climbing from a different spot. Mance hoisted himself up, arm over arm, ignoring the pain in his shoulders. The ice was slick, the wind fierce. Halfway up, an arrow hissed past his ear. He muttered a quick vow to the old gods and continued climbing. Every muscle burned. He felt the cold through his gloves. The rope bit into his palms. But the top came closer, and at last he could see wildlings standing, swords drawn, next to a battered black brother lying in a growing pool of his own blood. A pair of strong arms helped Mance swing a leg over the rim. He collapsed onto the walkway of solid ice. The top of the wall was wide enough for a small road, and often the crows used it to patrol between towers. Mance got to his feet, breathing heavily, and saw a half-dozen watchers lying dead. Another half-dozen had fled to a nearby tower, presumably to regroup or bar the door. Scores of free folk now scrambled atop the walkway, brandishing weapons, hollering in triumph. Mance gathered his bearings. The wind was ferocious, buffeting from all sides. The view south was dizzying, but there it was, the realm of the Kneelers, stretching in a patchwork of fields and forests. Winter had not fully claimed it yet, though the snows were creeping in. If the watchers retreated to the tower, they might hold out for a time. But with so many wildlings here, it was only a matter of time before that tower fell, or the watchers fled. He heard a roar of triumph from Rattleshirt, whose bone armor clattered as he charged the tower door. Some of his men used a makeshift battering ram, a fallen post from the walkway. With a resounding crash, they began hammering at the heavy wooden barrier. The watchers inside shoved or braced it. For a moment it held firm. Then a swirl of black cloaks appeared along the top ramparts of the tower, loosing arrows on Rattleshirt's men. The invaders scattered, cursing as one was struck in the thigh. Mance approached with caution. "We don't need that tower," he said to Rattleshirt, raising his voice above the wind's howl. "Focus on lowering the gate. Let the crows rot in there if they will." Rattleshirt gave a clattering chuckle. "And let them shoot our people from behind? I say no. I'll stuff them out so none can come at us from the rear." Mance didn't relish a prolonged fight here. The more time they spent, the more likely more crows would come, or even the northern lords might muster. Yet Rattleshirt was not wrong. Having black brothers behind them would be a serious threat. "Fine," Mance said, "but be quick about it. Send someone around the back if you can. We must keep moving." Rattleshirt signaled to his men to circle the tower's base. A few climbers tried to descend the far side of the wall to reach the ground in the Seven Kingdoms. They would attempt to open a gate or find some pass. Meanwhile, more free folk poured over the top. Children, old men, all came, though they were watched warily by those who had already scrambled up. The watchers' arrows claimed more victims, but not enough to halt the flood. At last, with a thunderous crash, the tower door gave way. Rattleshirt and a wave of wildlings stormed inside. The clash of steel echoed out into the bitter air. Screams followed. Moments later, a black brother toppled from a high window, arms flailing. He struck the walkway with a sickening impact and lay still. Another tried to jump onto a rope to escape, but a wildling arrow caught him in the back. He plunged down the southern side of the wall, vanishing into the dizzying drop below. When the free folk emerged again, none of the watchers followed. Rattleshirt walked out last, caked in fresh blood, rattling his bones with triumphant glee. "Dead, all of them," he said, "or soon will be." Mance nodded. That was the cost of this invasion. Neither side offered quarter in this savage meeting. In his heart, Mance felt a pang. These crows had been his brothers once, and he knew many among them were good men. But that time had long passed. Necessity drove the free folk south, and there was no sense lamenting it now. He moved to the edge of the wall, where thick ropes had been anchored for the descent. The free folk would need to get down in large numbers. Dawn was well behind them now, and the day was passing swiftly. He didn't have to look to know that Tormund's group would be engaged in a skirmish on the eastern side, or that the Watchers might be sending out ravens to alert the lords of the north. It would not be long before the north realized that a mass incursion was underway. One of the Vens, a tall man with a close-shaven scalp, addressed Mance. "We have men on the ground. They found the gatehouse, but it's sealed. We can break it, but it'll take time." "Then we do that," Mance said. "But hurry, send more men to help, and keep an eye on the road that leads to the Shadow Tower. If the watch tries to sally out, we'll need to hold them off." The Ven nodded and clambered down the rope. Mance observed the swirling white below. For a fleeting moment, he wished for an easier path. Why did the gods see fit to place a wall of ice between these people and safety? But there was no point in cursing the old stories. He had chosen this. One by one, the free folk descended. The day wore on. There was a moment of renewed alarm when some watchers from the next tower west came running along the top of the wall, but Rattleshirt's men repelled them. The watchers retreated again. Mance suspected they would regroup, perhaps gather a larger force, but by then half of his host would already be on the southern side, streaming into the fringes of the gift. He could not linger up here. He ordered those still on the wall to maintain a perimeter, then secured a rope for himself. He made the dangerous descent, step by step, clinging to the rope with white-knuckled hands, occasionally glancing down. Snow-laden air swirled around him, and the ground seemed terribly far. Still, he carried on, foot by foot, until at last his boots crunched into the unbroken snowdrift at the base of the southern side. He felt the exhaustion in every limb, but there was no rest to be had. The free folk formed a growing cluster there. Some were wide-eyed at the sight of a land not seen in their lifetimes. Tall pines, less stunted than those in the far north, and rolling hills. The smell was different, heavier with pine needles and damp earth rather than the pervasive ice. Mance felt a fierce flush of relief, mingled with dread of what came next. He spotted a group working to open a gate in the wall's base. The fortress gates were barred and reinforced from inside, but the wildlings had found a smaller sally port, half buried in snow. They were hacking at it with axes, prying the latch. A battered black brother lay outside, presumably having tried to bar their way, but his watch had ended. A few of the free folk scouted the nearby area. They found an abandoned watch station, a stable with a pair of panicked horses. The watchers must have fled or been pulled to the main fight. Mance ordered that the horses be calmed and prepared. If they were healthy, they could carry some of the children who were too exhausted to march further. Eventually, with a splintering crash, the old sally port gave way. The free folk poured inside only to emerge on the other side. They had effectively opened a passage through the wall that did not require climbing. More would come behind them. Words spread in excited murmurs. "The way is open! We're south of the wall!" Cheers erupted among some, but Mance did not share their relief yet. The hard part was only beginning. He called on the clan leaders to gather near him, near the jagged breach in the ice. Rattleshirt arrived, bone armor stained, grinning. The then leader solemn. The Hornfoot chieftain, limping from an arrow graze. Val was there too, quietly assessing. They formed a circle around Mance, who spoke in a low, urgent voice. "The crow horn has sounded," he said. "Tormund is out there, but we have not seen him yet. We must assume the Watch has sent ravens to Winterfell, to other lordlings who hold these lands. The kings down south may be busy killing each other, but the Stark boy might still gather a force if he hears we're crossing the wall in thousands." Rattleshirt made a scoffing sound. "Let them come. Our numbers are greater still." Mance eyed him. "We don't want open battle if we can avoid it. Our people are half-starved, carrying children, wounded. Even if we could fight the armies of the north, the losses would be terrible. We must move quickly, spread out if we must, but our best hope is to push deeper south before they can muster. Find lands to settle or seize, or a path onward. We'll keep to the outskirts of the major holdfasts. The Starks might not be in Winterfell. I've heard rumors that Ned Stark is dead and that his son is off warring. But one of his younger sons or some other warden might remain." A few of the clan leaders exchanged uneasy glances. Mance pressed on. "We do not know how quickly they can gather an army, but with ravens, word can travel fast. So we do not tarry. In smaller parties, we might evade detection. We're not here to conquer the north. We're here to survive. Mark that." He looked pointedly at Rattleshirt. Rattleshirt just jangled his bones. "You speak of survival. I'll speak of taking what's ours. This land was free once. The Kneelers took it." Mance sighed. "We can argue the histories later. For now, get your men ready to move. Take the southwestern route, skirt the mountains. The Thens can go east and circle around. We'll cause confusion, keep them guessing about our numbers and direction. Those who want to slip into the forests and hide can do so. We'll regroup beyond the hills." They broke apart, each clan leader returning to gather their people. Snow was still falling, swirling in random gusts. The sun was dipping westward, casting a pale glow through the overcast sky. Mance wiped sweat from his brow. There was so much to do, so many to organize. A ragged throng was crossing the breach, stumbling onto southern soil for the first time in their lives. Some knelt to touch the ground. Others were too numb to do anything but press forward, looking for a patch of shelter from the wind. Far off to the east, the rumble of horns indicated Tormund's group was still engaged. Mance wished he could help, but this was the plan. They would keep the watch pinned while the main host came through. Tormund was no fool. He'd find a way to break through and join the rest. Night fell. The free folk made camp in scattered pockets on the southern side, well beyond bowshot of the wall. They started fires among clusters of pine trees, scouted for game, tried to bed down. Many were exhausted from the climb, and the relief of having the wall behind them was overshadowed by the knowledge that enemies lay ahead. Mance settled near one of the larger fires, arms folded around himself, cloak pulled tight. Val sat across from him, coaxing warmth from the flames. They were joined by the Hornfoot chieftain, a wiry older man named Bedro. A few then stood at a distance, silent watch. Val spoke softly, her voice almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "We've lost at least 100 climbing the wall or in the arrow hail. Many more are wounded. The Watchers put up a good fight." Mance's face tightened. "A smaller loss than I feared, but still too many. We'll see more dead before we find a safe place." Bedro stared into the flames, expression grim. "We should have crossed sooner, before the crows had time to gather. But we are here now. Perhaps the Kneelers' troubles to the south will keep them from sending an army." "No army, maybe, but the lords of the north are not all at war," Mance said. "Some hold their castles. If they hear that wildlings are raiding or that thousands of free folk are on the move, they may send their own banners. The Karstarks, the Umbers, some remain loyal to House Stark or to the idea of the north. Even if the Starks themselves are away, these lesser lords might move to defend their lands." Val gave a small shrug. "Then we move swiftly. We cannot stay in one place." Mance nodded. He glanced around at the weary faces of those near the fire, saw them nodding off. A tear-streaked mother tried to hush her whimpering toddler. A trio of archers cleaned their bowstrings meticulously. Everyone seemed at the edge of exhaustion. That night, the free folk shivered under newly felled branches, using pine boughs to build makeshift shelters. They posted watches, but no immediate threat emerged. Occasional howls of wolves drifted on the air, but no horns sounded from the wall. In the distance, a faint glow might have been the fires of the Night's Watch or a reflection of moonlight on the ice. No one dared approach to find out. By morning, Tormund had arrived. He led a battered band of wildlings, some limping, many with arrow wounds. They'd lost men scaling the eastern section, but they had forced their way over. More were presumably still scattered across the top or searching for ways to descend. Tormund's broad face was streaked with blood, his beard in disarray, but he grinned when he saw Mance, clapping him on the arm. "We made it, old friend," Tormund said. "Lost more than I'd like, but we're through. I've got a few more heading west along the top of the wall, making sure we keep any crows from flanking us. But we can't hold that walkway forever." "We won't need to," Mance said. "We'll be gone soon enough. They can keep their wall, for all I care, as long as we're past it." Tormund let out a bellow of a laugh. "Ha! And I hope they freeze alone up there." But his face fell when he looked around at the worn survivors. "What now?" "Now we break into parties as planned," Mance replied. "We slip into the countryside. I'll lead one group toward the hills west of the Gift. You take a second group south along the King's Road, but keep off the main track, moving in the forests. Rattleshirt, the Thens, the rest, they'll find their own routes. We'll rendezvous near the White Knife in a moon's turn if all goes well." Tormund frowned. "A moon's turn? That's a long time to hide. But so be it. The crows might have men on the King's Road." They might, so we stay off it for the most part but cross it when we must. We need to find food. The Gifts farmland is right here, though much is snowed under. The small folk are scattered. We can gather supplies, but be careful. We don't want them screaming for help from some northern lord. Tormund nodded, though caution was not his strong suit. Understood. We'll move at dusk. They parted ways. Mance spent the next hours helping reorganize the host. Families were reunited, though some discovered loved ones had been lost on the climb. The weeping was quiet but devastating. Mance steeled his heart. There would be more grief before the end. When dusk arrived, the massive throng splintered into many smaller groups, each led by someone who knew the lay of the land, either from scouting or from old stories. Some might remain together in the wilderness, hunting deer. Others might attempt to find villages where they could trade or threaten for supplies. The free folk were not a single army, but a confederation of tribes and families. Controlling them all would be like herding cats. But Mance had done his best to instill a sense of cooperation. Survival required it. Mance led around 300, including Val, a group of archers, and some who were skilled in woodcraft. They traveled quietly, steering clear of roads, making their way westward, always mindful of watchers in the sky. The land was gentler here than beyond the wall, with thicker forests and gentler hills, but winter's grip was evident. Streams were frozen, the ground white. Occasionally, they saw signs of civilization. A smoke plume rising from a farmhouse or a small hamlet. Mance would send scouts who reported back on how many folk lived there, how well armed they might be. If the place seemed large or well defended, Mance instructed his people to move on. If it was small, and the inhabitants seemed likely to yield, the free folk might approach carefully, offering trade or demands. They gleaned what provisions they could: salted meat, turnips stored in cellars, perhaps a donkey or two. Word of wildlings on the move would spread, but they had little choice. They needed food, and winter had left them with meager hunting prospects. Farther east, Tormund's band rumbled southward in a similar manner, no doubt scaring the local small folk. And scattered across the north, Rattleshirt, the Thens, and others did the same. Perhaps some would find hidden corners to settle in until the worst was over, while others might keep roaming. It did not take long for rumors to swirl among the northern villagers. A farmer's wife told them, trembling, that she'd heard that Lord Stark was dead in King's Landing, beheaded by the Lannisters. That news triggered anger and confusion among the wildlings. Some had known Eddard Stark was no friend to wildlings, yet he was known as an honorable man. If the Kneelers in the south killed him, perhaps the north was in chaos. Mance gleaned from further talk that Robb Stark, Ned's eldest son, had been declared king in the north. He was mustering an army to fight the Lannisters in the south. Great battles raged in the Riverlands, and lords like the Umbers and Karstarks had marched south with him, leaving their keeps lightly guarded. It was the best possible news for the free folk. The armies of the north were away. Only a few men remained scattered in watchtowers or commanding small garrisons. The greatest threat might actually come from the Night's Watch themselves, if they mustered men along the wall. But the watch was said to be undermanned. Indeed, Mance had just bested them in crossing. Perhaps the tide of free folk would remain unstoppable. But the realm was not empty, and many houses had not marched. The Boltons in the Dreadfort, the Manderleys in White Harbor, the Serwyns at Castle Serwyn. Some might have left men behind. So Mance insisted on caution. They must not draw the full wrath of any great lord. If the wildlings incited enough terror, the lords might ride back north in force. The first major clash came near a hamlet called Old Mill, on the outskirts of the Umber lands. A group of wildlings attempted to seize the mill's grain store, only to find a party of local men armed with spears. A furious skirmish ensued. Wildling axes and spears against the old, rusted weaponry of the northern smallfolk. Mance was not present, but word reached him that the wildlings had prevailed, leaving a handful of villagers dead. The rest fled. A few wildlings also died from nasty spear wounds. The mill's store of grain proved meager once they accounted for the weevils. Further west, there were reports of free folk encounters with the mountain clans of the north, clans like the Littles, the Wools, the Harclays. Those mountainous northerners were a fierce, proud people, not so different from the wildlings themselves. Rumor had it that some of them offered to trade with the free folk or even tolerated their passage. Others barred them with steel. Mance's band pushed deeper into the rugged highlands, hoping to find a more defensible spot to rest. Snow fell steadily, blanketing tracks and making travel slower. Val scouted ahead on light feet, while the others carried the children. The nights were long, and the cold never relented. Yet day by day they survived. And day by day, the War of the Five Kings raged in the distance. The free folk occasionally encountered messengers or local lords in small numbers, surprised to find wildlings so far south. Some were robbed or turned away at spear point. No great host had yet formed to drive the free folk out. One afternoon, as Mance's band emerged from a pine forest onto a narrow pass, they saw a flicker of movement among the boulders. Instantly, Mance motioned for caution. The group halted. Archers knocked arrows. Silence. Then a man's voice echoed from behind a rock. "Who goes there? In the name of House Stark, I order you to lay down arms." A short bark of laughter came from a wildling next to Mance. In answer, Mance called back, "We serve no house. We're free folk passing through." "This is Stark land," the voice insisted. "Lay down your arms and you'll be treated fairly." Mance shared a glance with Val. "We have no desire to harm you," he shouted. "But we will not lay down arms. Let us pass unmolested, and we'll do you no wrong." Silence. Then a different voice. "They're wildlings." A third voice hissed. "I see them. Look at their leathers, their furs." They climbed the wall. Mance could sense the men's fear. They might be a small group of guards or perhaps a local patrol. He raised his hand, calling out, "Go in peace, friends. We want only to move on." But that was not enough. An arrow flew from behind the boulder. It thudded into the snow near Mance's foot. The tension snapped. The wildlings returned fire. A harsh volley of arrows rattled against rocks. There were shouts, cursing, sounds of panic. Mance led a flanking approach. A few wildlings slipped around the side, scaled a rock face, and cornered the men. In a matter of heartbeats, it was over. The men, a handful of older guards and perhaps a younger lad, lay disarmed, trembling. One was wounded with an arrow in the leg. The others cowered. Mance stood over them, chest heaving, though no real fight had transpired. Val frowned, her gaze shifting to Mance. They were not crows, just local men trying to do their duty. "What do we do with them?" asked a wildling warrior, brandishing a spear. "They tried to kill us." The captured men stared at Mance in terror. Mance remembered the lessons he'd learned among the Watch about mercy. He gave a tight-lipped sigh. "We do nothing. They can go back and spread the word that we are here. Killing them won't help us, and it may rouse more anger. Bandage the wounded man's leg if you can, and send them on their way." The spear-wielding wildling looked uncertain, but he obeyed. They cut up an old cloth to bind the guard's wound, then stepped back. The men seemed dazed. "You're letting us go?" asked the older guard, disbelief in his voice. "We are," Mance said, "but stay out of our path." The guards wasted no time in helping their injured companion. They limped away, casting fearful glances behind them. The wildlings let them pass. Val studied Mance. "They'll tell others about us. About your mercy." Mance shrugged. "So be it. Some might call him a fool for not silencing them. But he did not want to become a butcher. They would talk, yes, perhaps stirring up more trouble. Yet it might also sow seeds of confusion. He could only hope. They continued their trek. Days passed, filled with short skirmishes, mostly minor. The free folk harried small villages and outposts, took what they needed to survive the journey. Word spread across the north. Strange folk with neither banner nor lord roamed in large numbers, rumored to be wildlings from beyond the wall. Many small folk fled or barricaded themselves. Some prayed for the return of the king in the north. Others turned to their local lords for help. In Winterfell, uncertain developments brewed. Lord Eddard Stark was indeed dead, and his son Robb had marched south with most of the able-bodied men to wage war against House Lannister. Bran Stark, a crippled boy, was left behind under the guidance of Maester Luwin and Ser Rodrik Castle. They had only a small garrison, enough to keep order in the castle itself. The direwolves roamed the Godswood. Letters arrived from the Night's Watch, frantic missives about wildlings crossing in great numbers. The dire threat was overshadowed by the war in the south, but Ser Rodrik, old and stout-hearted, recognized the potential disaster. He mustered what men he could spare, though it was a paltry force, 30 men, maybe 40. Hardly enough to chase thousands of free folk scattered across the north. Still, he tried. Groups were dispatched to guard major roads, to protect the harvest that remained. Ravens flew to White Harbor, the Dreadfort, Deepwood Motte, calling on those left behind to unite. But the lords were reluctant or slow to respond, each uncertain how many men they could afford to lose. Rumors said the Ironborn threatened the western coasts, that King Balon Greyjoy might be stirring. Chaos reigned in the north. Mance heard these tidings from travelers, gleaning bits of knowledge. He realized that they had indeed timed their invasion at a moment of maximum confusion. But if any one great lord returned with an army, they might be pinned. The free folk remained watchful, always on the move. They came across a small crofters' village nestled in a hollow. Smoke rose from the chimneys. Mance paused on the ridge. Night was falling. He had about 100 wildlings with him. The rest of his band had split to scout. He debated whether to approach peacefully or bypass it. But the biting hunger in his group was too great. They had to try for supplies. With slow steps they descended. A watchdog barked as they neared. Then more. Torchlight flickered in the windows of the huts. The wildlings fanned out. A few villagers emerged, brandishing pitchforks and knives. Mance raised his arms, calling for calm. "We mean you no harm," he said. "But we need food. We will pay if we can. If not, we'll take it." The villagers, frightened, looked at each other. One older man spat. "I've heard of you. You're from beyond the wall. Thieves and rapers, they say. People just like you," Mance countered. "Driven by the cold. We'll not kill if we don't have to." Some huts slammed doors shut. Others opened them, letting children peek out. The tension was thick. A wildling near Mance hissed, "We should just do this quickly." But Mance pressed gently. He showed them a pouch of silver coins looted from a merchant's wagon. The old man stared, uncertain. Finally, he nodded grudgingly. "We have what we have. It isn't much." The wildlings took the lumps of salt beef, stored grains, a few root vegetables. They paid with silver, some southern coin, scraps of jewelry scavenged from crows. The villagers watched in silence. One woman asked timidly if the wildlings would protect them from bandits. That question drew uneasy chuckles. Mance said, "We have our own troubles, but we won't harm you if you keep quiet about our passing." They left soon after, bellies slightly fuller. Yet that small transaction underscored how precarious their existence was. Some villages might be willing to trade, but fear was rampant. Next time it might end in bloodshed. A week later, with nights growing ever longer, Mance's group reached the foothills near the western mountains. Pine forests rose around them, dark and silent. Snow-laden branches drooped overhead. They made camp in a secluded valley. Scouts reported that a handful of mountain clans roamed nearby, but they seemed neither hostile nor welcoming. So Mance resolved to keep a low profile. Perhaps they could last the winter here, hidden away. But how many free folk had the same idea? The region could not sustain them all. Hunting was poor. Soon they would start to starve again. He thought often of the others, the White Walkers. They had fled that menace by crossing the wall, but if winter grew stronger, who was to say that threat would remain in the far north? Perhaps the others would find a way past the wall as well. That fear gnawed at Mance's mind. He had done what he deemed right, brought his people south to safety. But the realm was still in chaos. He could not foresee how this would end. The war in the south continued to ripple outward, and in the Riverlands, the young wolf battled the Lannisters. Occasional deserters or wounded men from those battles wandered north again, carrying wild rumors of kings, betrayals, and direwolves. Some heard talk that King Stannis Baratheon was building a fleet at Dragonstone, or that King Renly had died under mysterious circumstances. Others spoke of the Greyjoy attacks on the northern coast. All of it underscored that the north was vulnerable. The free folk took advantage, flowing like water through the cracks. Yet even water can freeze. The deeper the winter set in, the more dire the circumstances. Wolves grew bolder, howling close at night. Food dwindled. Mance began to hear tragic stories. Entire smaller groups of free folk wiped out by local defenders, or ambushed by the Watch, or simply starved in the wilderness. A few more violent wildling bands terrorized farmsteads, leaving burnt huts and bodies, which only inflamed the fear among the North's inhabitants. That fear might unify them, might push them to raise a proper host. Mance weighed his options. He could attempt a more direct route south, beyond the Neck, but the swamps there were patrolled by the Crannogmen loyal to House Reed, and beyond that lay the might of the southern armies. They might face even fiercer resistance if they crossed into the Riverlands or beyond. With children and elderly in tow, any large-scale journey was fraught with peril. In the midst of this quandary, a rider arrived in Mance's camp. He wore a tattered black cloak. Tormund, who was visiting from his own nearby camp, roared in anger, thinking it was a crow. But the rider lifted his head and revealed a weathered face. It was one of Mance's old friends from the Watch, who had deserted ages ago to join him. His name was Orson. "Mance," Orson said in an urgent rasp, "I have news. The Watch is rallying. They have a new Lord Commander, Ser Alliser Thorne, an old enemy of ours. He's sworn to purge the wildlings who crossed. They're pleading for men from the Northern Lords, and some are answering. They've begun to form a host near Castle Black. Maybe a few hundred men, 1,000 at most. But that might be enough to push across the Gift and into the wilderness after us." Tormund spat. "Let them come. We'll crush them, or vanish into the mountains." Orson shook his head. "It's not just the Watch, Tormund. We have reports that the Boltons may ride from the Dreadfort, and the Umbers from Last Hearth if they return. Word travels slowly, but if any of them come north, we could be faced with thousands. Even with our numbers, we can't face a united North in open battle." A chill settled on the gathering. Mance realized the free folk might have stung the hornet's nest. The Watchers wouldn't rest until they had driven them out or destroyed them. King in the north or not, there were still enough loyal bannermen to muster a dangerous force. "We must consider a parley," Mance murmured half to himself. Tormund gave him a sharp look. "A parley? We tried that once and got naught but scorn." "I know, but times have changed," Mance said. "Their realm is in chaos, but so is ours. Perhaps they'd be more open to letting us settle if they see we're not here to conquer." Tormund snorted. "They see us as nothing but raiders and murderers. Parley will do naught." Mance pressed his lips together. He had no illusions about how the Kneelers viewed wildlings. But perhaps a Stark might have listened, or those who upheld Ned Stark's memory. Then again, Ned was gone. This was another reason Mance had crossed earlier. Fewer negotiations, more desperation. He decided to bide his time, see how the Lords responded. If the host truly formed, they might have no choice but to retreat west or break for the Neck. Unless they risked open battle. That would be disastrous. Winter advanced. The War of the Five Kings churned on, pulling men south. Yet from scattered tidings, it seemed that some in the north were indeed turning back, alarmed by the scale of the wildling presence. Forces from White Harbor, Bear Island, or the Dreadfort might be on the move. The Watch pressed south from Castle Black, burning out any free folk they found in the Gift. Mance's hope of slipping unnoticed was fading, replaced by a slow, grinding war of attrition. Mance weighed a desperate plan. If he could gather the free folk again, present a unified front, they might force a negotiation. But rallying thousands of scattered wildlings across half the north was no easy feat, and if the Lords refused, it would be a bloodbath. He sent out runners to Tormund, Rattleshirt, Val, the Thens, urging them to gather near the foot of the mountains. Over weeks, small bands arrived, battered and cold, carrying tales of minor victories and grave losses. Tormund reappeared, leading a ragged group that had fought a pitched battle with a local lord's levy. Rattleshirt was missing an eye, the socket bound with a filthy cloth. The then Magnar had lost half his men to disease. Some clans simply did not come. Perhaps they had chosen to settle their own corners or had been wiped out. In the end, fewer than 4,000 were under Mance's banner, a fraction of the initial crossing. Spring was nowhere in sight, and rumor suggested a fierce winter was settling in for the long haul. The free folk huddled in valleys, short on food and hope, while uncertain forces in the north gathered. The watchers from the wall might have grown bolder, sending rangers to ambush smaller wildling parties. The land turned harsh. Morale plummeted. At last, Mance made a decision. We cannot survive a scattered existence if the north forms a host to pick us off. Better we gather our might and seek a single place to stand. If we can hold it, perhaps they will parley. He studied a map taken from a captured merchant. There's a ruin called the Night Fort on the wall. The Watch rarely uses it. Maybe we can break through there and bring any remaining free folk to our side. From that vantage, we could negotiate, or we might threaten them enough to keep them at bay. It was a gamble, one last throw of the dice. Tormund grumbled but agreed, seeing no better alternative. Rattleshirt raged about wanting to kill crows, but he was too wounded and too short of men to do otherwise. The Thens marched grim-faced. They headed east, skirting the gift, pushing back to the wall. The Watchers harried them, archers appearing at vantage points. The free folk returned fire. Blood was spilled on both sides. Some of the crows recognized Mance from afar, cursing him as a deserter and a traitor. He pressed on. And so, ironically, they found themselves at the wall again, near the crumbling fortress of the Night Fort. The wide moat around it was partially frozen. The gate was sealed shut, the castle in ruins. The Watch had smaller patrols posted, but they retreated in alarm when they saw the mass of wildlings approaching. Mance's plan was to seize the ruin, hold it, and force the Watchers into a standoff. But even that was uncertain. They had come full circle, battered and reduced in number, with the winter winds howling. On the day they reached the Night Fort, a fierce wind whipped across the battlements. The free folk set up a perimeter. The old towers loomed above them, black and broken. Somewhere, a crow's horn echoed. Mance gazed at the ancient castle with exhaustion in his bones. Tormund stood beside him, leaning on his sword. "Are we any better off?" Tormund asked. "We're hungry, we're cold, we're back under the shadow of this bloody wall." Mance shook his head. "No, old friend, we're not better off. But perhaps this is where we stand or fall. The north is stirring, we can't keep running. If the Watchers come, we parley or fight. The gods will decide." Tormund looked out over the ranks of shivering wildlings, many wounded or weak. "The gods must be mad if this is our fate." Mance closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the impetus of all this. The nightmares beyond the wall, the others who threatened all life. "We had no other choice," he said. "Not truly." He opened his eyes to see snow drifting from the sky, each flake settling upon the old stones of the Night Fort. The War of the Five Kings raged far to the south, but here, at the edge of the world, another war was about to begin. A war for survival, for a chance to stand against winter itself. If the North would not let them pass, they would make their stand on the threshold. And so they waited, huddled in the gloom, the king beyond the wall and his weary people, having broken through the wall ahead of the War of the Five Kings, only to discover that no realm offered easy refuge. They waited for an answer that might never come, and the winds of winter howled around them all.